Most people looked at the void and saw nothing. Croy heard a scream. It arrived not as a voice but as pressure, a low animal howling that bent the hull and rattled the molybdenum plates beneath his feet. It traveled like a sound without air, through the bone of the ship, through the blood at the base of his skull, as if grief had chosen a frequency and nothing on the Dominion could stay silent to it. His hands went cold. The comms board in the shuttle window traced a thin green line that trembled with every pulse of that sound. Around him, the three technicians kept their faces neutral in the way Admiralty trained men and women do when they do not want their panic to be a contagion. Croy listened. They had stamped Asset across him at 22, Asset 49, communication dampener, expendable in any calculus. He'd had time to memorize how the word felt on his skin. Expendable had an odor, bleach and metal, and the faint hot iron of years spent carrying other people's noise. He had been prodded and measured in labs where technicians in white shirts spoke the word with syllables like numbers. In the fleet registry, his file read more like a tool inventory than a person. Resonance capacity, high. Empathic bleed potential, acute. Social class, Omega. The designation had closed doors and sharpened stairs. It had also given him the only currency he could trade freely, the ability to listen until a machine, a planet, or a living thing stopped hurting. Approach Vector Alpha 307. Admiral Bernance's voice intoned over the shuttle line, all clipped consonants and ocean-steady certainty. The Admiral had eyes like ledger paper, slate, neat, and all the way around a man who had to make decisions that would be read in briefings and later burned into report archives. You are the beacon, Croy. Protocol 0 is enacted. You make contact, you report, and you, the voice softened almost imperceptibly, you make their intent known. They would not say the other part aloud in the briefing room. They would not draft it into the mission code, because then it might leak into the memos and the family files. They would not give his mother any official notice of the bargain, but the implication hung between them all like a used fuse. A probe contacts a living void. If the void kills the probe, it is an acceptable loss. If it does not, then perhaps a solution. If it does not, then the fleet can pretend no lives were endangered that day. Croy knew the geometry of their calculus and where he fit in it. The Admiral's promise of intent known did not include the possibility of return. The shuttle cut through the black like a throat, small and unprotected. Silence outside was not nothing. It was a presence that stained the air with cold. The Voidwalker waited at the edge of a dead system, a needle of shadow rotating slow and terrible. Its silhouette ate the stars behind it until the whole sky looked riddled with holes.
From inside the craft, Croy read the thing not with his eyes, but with the long, slow empathy the fleet taught to a small number of Omegas so they could function under stress. He felt the walker's loneliness like a broken instrument string, vibrating to a ghost song. "Watch your step," the pilot muttered at the airlock, as if there were really anything to trip on in the architecture of absence. The docking ring sealed with the soft sound of rubbed glass filing into glass. Light from the shuttle bled into a darkness that did not answer. For a moment, Croy wanted to press his palm to the outside metal and call to the world that had stamped him expendable. He did not. Instead, he breathed in the metallic smell of the sealed corridor, ozone, and the rich, resinous scent of other worlds' rain preserved in the Voidwalker's hull. The smell was like an old prayer. They used the term Voidwalker like a ship's class, a living black spire, an ethereal guard designed long ago to sequester rifts and contain devastation. What the manuals did not say, could not say without the sort of language that made fleet men blanch, was that the Ethel were also, sometimes, containers of loss. The walker ahead of them carried a weight like a buried city. Croy could feel the sediments colliding inside its bones. The interior swallowed their lights. The passageways curved like the inside of a hollow cathedral. When the ladder descended to a platform, the steel sang. The song traveled up his spine and made his stomach climb into his throat. He could feel the walker's consciousness around him like a tide. It was enormous. It was tired. It was hungry for silence. Nash lived in the anatomy of that hunger. Nash was larger than the schematics led Croy to expect. Even seated in the heart of the walker, strapped to a bed of braided alloys and pipes that had the feel of an old throne, Nash's shoulders carved the air as if they could have been the side of a canyon. His skin, if that is the right word for the matter on which the Ethel's flesh was patterned, was the color of a moon after ash, all deep matte blacks and blue taupe that shifted under light. He smelled at first like iron and cold rain, and a faint sweetness that the mind could not place. The thing that made Croy stumble was not Nash's size. It was the sound that he carried beneath his breath, a long, raw moan tangled with wind. The first time their eyes met, Croy's tight and human, Nashes like coals smoldering beneath cinder, time and arrowed. Croy felt in the tooth of that moment how tiny he was on the scale of Nash's existence, and how dangerous smallness could be sometimes. The Enigma's presence poured through the room like pressure, as if a storm were thinking in a throat. Croy's ribs moved with the motion. Nash's voice, when it came, was not a voice but a weather pattern. It was a series of shudders and hums, low and old, and running on rhythms Croy's training did not chart. It could have been anger. It could have been pain.
It had the terrible dignity of centuries. It had done the job fleet legends had given it. It had learned to keep the rift from unbinding the sky. "I am not here to kill you," the Enigma said. Or perhaps he thought it at Croy, the meaning unfurling without the shape of words. Croy's monitors flashed, vocal approximations translating Nash's frequencies into flat text. The translations were clumsy and felt like the shore pounding against an ocean that would not stay tamed. Croy had been given protocols for calming ships and people, for dampening frequencies, for modulating fear. He had not, however, been handed instructions for what to do when an ancient sentinel looked at him as if he were the last moment in the long ledger of its existence. For the first time since he'd been labeled an asset, his agency felt like an ember. He moved forward with the careful, slow steps of someone who had learned not to startle things that could split the world by flinching. He tucked the back of his hand to his chest, felt the tremor there, a resonance that was both a gift and a hazard, and hummed the note they had taught him in the academy, a narrow pitch, a thread. The taut sound traveled down his bones and out through his lips. It was less musical than it was purposeful, a key cut to the frequency the Enigma's body had been thrumming against for centuries. Nash flinched as if someone had pressed a hand into a raw bruise. The moan diminished into something thinner and edged. Croy kept the note, steady like a metronome. It was not control, it was conversation by touch. For a long heartbeat, the whole walker exhaled, and the pressure that had been making the walls want to buckle eased. "Do not," a voice crackled through the comms. Admiral Bernance's face bled through on a small hollow projected near the foot of the bed. He stood ramrod straight in projection, his suit immaculate, the Dominion flag like a soft halo behind him. Bernance's jaw was a line of paperwork. He looked at Croy as if he were both proud and very annoyed at the same time. "Maintain contact," Bernance said. His voice carried the authority that had sent entire colonies into quarantine and had been the reason so many people in portraits grew old before their time. He swallowed. His throat tasted of copper. He wanted to say, "You sent me to die, you know this." He knew better than to say that into a broadcast with the Admiral live. Instead, he focused on the single, thin frequency that had stopped Nash from rocking in the basin of his own grief. The Enigma's breath came easier. Color, if one could call Nash's deep, moving tones color, flashed across the walker like a calm tide. The ship hummed, not quite content, not yet healed, but reasonable, like a wound that had been set and was cooling.
Somewhere within Nash's chest, the idea that he might be permitted, by the sky, by the fleet, by some ancient law immune to the petty reckonings of men, to let his guard down for a minute, trembled and softened. They had expected him to scream. They had expected the void to swallow any visitor and the fleet to take the excuse to burn the coordinates and call it a quarantine win. That had been the plan, in its simplest cruelty. They were sending the expendable to an entity whose entire biography in their files read like a thread level. If the Enigma destroyed him, the Dominion could wash its hands. If the Enigma spared him, the fleet might claim a diplomatic success. That was the ledger Bernance preferred. Croy, however, heard other things layered under Nash's sound. The memory of children singing to study a storm, a chorus of timbers groaning in an age-old gale, a single human voice calling someone's name in the middle of the night. There was also, Croy realized with nauseous clarity, a violence that had been inflicted on this walker a century earlier. A stain of language in Nash's mind that flared and described a neurotoxin, a sudden mutiny, crews gone. The Enigma had been left to hold the rest. "Why did they leave you?" Croy asked, softer than any protocol allowed. Nash's eyes closed. The answer was not a confessional. It was a weather system. Croy, feeling the question in his marrow, translated it into a resonance that felt like an invitation. Nash let him in. For a time, the ship's metal settled. The unbearable pressure that had been the walker's scream thinned into the quieter background static of an organism simply being itself. "Pain," Nash said at last, and the word cracked across the wide emptiness like a wrecked mast. It suggested many things: betrayal, duty, the slow rot of centuries. Croy listened to the shape of it. He did what he had always done when everything else in the fleet dissolved into numbers. He offered care in the only terms he had learned. "You're not alone now," he said, and the sentence was less promise than transaction, an exchange of frequencies. Not unless you want to be. There was no theater in Nash's reaction. The Enigma, enormous as he was, and weary as he had become, tilted his head slightly. It was the smallest motion, something akin to curiosity. For the first time in a long time, a sleeping cellular thing inside the walker aligned itself in a way that suggested relief. Croy felt it like warmth under an ice field. 2 days passed in the rhythm of repair and whispered conversation, as if time had shrunk to the dimensions of small domesticities. Croy took to wandering the walker's innards, where beams of filtered starlight made dust-floating motes look like suspended thoughts. The hydroponics, when he found them, smelled of green things the Dominion's biologists couldn't name, but had adapted into the ship's close cycles.
Nash moved slowly through the corridors in the ways of something used to being bigger than the spaces it occupied, and Croy learned to read the creaks as if they were Morse code, subtle signals of the Enigma's discomfort. He taught the ship to accept the pinch of human touch in places where metal met skin. In exchange, Nash taught him to listen differently, not to flatten feeling into a dampening slug, but to route it, translate, and set it into constructive frequencies. There were moments of laughing, too, small, almost indecent ruptures of joy in a precinct forbidden for it. Once, Croy found an alcove where light pooled like honey, and Nash's bulk made a cathedral shadow. They shared a bowl of hydroponic fruit that tasted faintly of planet soil. Nash, huge and awkward, tried to pick the fruit with 2 enormous hands and watched Croy's nimble fingers make the work efficient. Croy had not expected tenderness to exist on so large a scale. Nash had not expected to smile. It was a small miracle neither had permission to experience, and they stole it like contraband. But even as something like home formed inside the walker, the fleet's presence braided itself back into their lives like an inevitable winter. Broadcasts came slotted with the clinical distance of officialdom. The Admiral watched through a dozen thin windows of feed and wrote his orders in a language that never allowed for empathy. At times, Bernance's authority interfaced with the walker in ways that made the entire ship bristle, like a sleeping animal that had just been poked. "Containment is a priority," Admiral Bernance told Croy once, voice flat as a seal. "The Armada will perform a show of force to test the guard's integrity. If it endangers navulator lines, we will neutralize." Croy had thought neutralized was a euphemism for a surgical demolition. In the queue behind Bernance's words were other people who might disappear quietly if the math favored such things. Croy felt cold underneath his skin. Nash, listening, moved like a shuttered wave. The Enigma's shoulders tightened, and the hum that had been an almost constant presence deepened into a barbaric chord of readiness. The walker was old and tired, and had held in its body ruptures that could unmake a small moon. Nash had trained himself to be the place where such violence could be held and bled away without turning the sky into blood. Croy had come for a mission. The mission's parameters did not include the intimacy that had begun in the spaces between their breaths. There came a point when Bernance's civilized patience uncurrent. He authorized an Armada's arrival, a line of ships like teeth set against the walker's flank. They came with the mechanical squall of mass, bringing with them a device that in the fleet's language they called a breaker, a concentrated gravity beam capable of cleaving planetary crust. They called it Planet Cracker behind closed doors, in order to control the horror of its purpose with a sanitized name. It could, Bernance said with comfortable regulatory tone in his feed, test the walker and, if necessary, end it. The Admiralty liked language that made violence sound like maintenance. Nash listened to the buildup of fleet chatter like a man listening to rain outside his window, counting the seconds between drops. In the more vulnerable intervals, his internal cry flared and thinned, and Croy felt each of those flares in his chest like little punches. He had been sent as an expendable measure. He had been expected to be the instrument of an outcome. Yet, as he watched Nash's exhaustion fold into resolve, Croy's calculations rearranged. Nash had a history that, when rendered into report form, read like a long, jagged apology. 5 centuries ago, the Walker had been crude. Nash had been a guardian then, trained to balance energies and contain the rift. Then a splintered faction had used a neurotoxin to remove dissent, leaving the Walker damaged. Nash had been abandoned with a wound in his mind and a cargo of grief. It had taken him centuries to learn how to corral that wound into something that could keep the rift from eating everything nearby. The Walker had been his prison and his penance. "Do you plan to die for it?" Croy asked one night, voice small in the metallic dim of the engine room. The machinery pulsed a soft, regular throb, and the air smelled like warm oil. Nash's answer was not immediate. For a long time he made small, odd noises, human in their cadence but not in their meaning. At last he said, "I was made to hold this. It is more honest than the fleet." Honest. The word hung in Croy's mouth like a dropped coin. He had never met anyone who claimed a singular purpose so purely. Nash had been built and made duty the axis of his life. The fleet had then used that axle as a lever to justify abandonment. Croy's chest ached with the weight of justice not yet served. The armada assembled at the edge of the Walker's gravity well like a ring of dark thorns. Ships the size of small cities arranged themselves into vectors, cameras and weapons bristling. They were unblinking. They were righteous. They carried the breaker and the cold language that always accompanied it, for the good of many. Bernan's on the holos looked as if the public ledger in his mind had already been reconciled. In private, his mind spun straws to justify the cost. Croy spent the hours before the attack with his hands wrapped around a rail, trying to breathe seawater where there was none. He could taste the metallic tang of fear in his mouth, an old, unpleasant friend. He kept returning to the memory of Nash tilting his head the way old wolves do when one of their pack returns from a long hunt, bloodied and silent. He had been sent on a mission. That mission had turned, with greedy, bureaucratic swiftness, into a playing piece.
The Dominion's arithmetic had made him a sacrificial numerator. Croy had 2 choices that had the weight of ethics pressed into them: obey and hope for a diplomatic miracle, or defy and risk everything. The crew and the fleet expected the first. The Walker's centuries of holding and being hollow suggested the second. He thought of his mother once, a soft woman who had taught him to braid hair, not out of duty, but because her fingers found peace in the motion. The thought brought a sharp sting. How would she explain to herself the shape he'd taken? Would she light a candle for him and recite a name he had not used for years? He had been trained to ignore future ghosts. Training and ear had always been his tools. His hands closed into a fist so tight his nails imprinted the skin. In the low hum of the Walker, his heartbeat sounded like a fist tapping out a Morse code of no. "Are you afraid?" Nash asked, voice thin in the narrow shared space of the command deck. He had not moved closer. He rarely moved quickly. That was part of Nash's dignity, the deliberate pace of a thing used to making large decisions before speaking. He could not be hurried. Croy liked him for it. "Yes," Croy admitted. It felt honest to say it aloud. Saying the word aloud unraveled it from something private into a thing that could be engaged with. The word took up space between them, and for a moment made the air easier to breathe. Nash's hand, enormous, layered like a folded tarp of living material, lifted and rested near Croy's elbow. The contact was heavy and calm, not crushing, an invitation to balance. "Then we will not be alone," Nash said, and the statement contained no royalness, no direction. It was only the beginning of a tacit negotiation. The Armai's final approach was a harsh, bristled shape that cut across the Walker's sensors. The breaker glowed in their transmissions like a cold sun, an instrument bright enough to bend the very syntax of rock and field. It would test the Walker's integrity and perhaps, according to Bernance's comfortable arithmetic, close a potential hazard with surgical precision. It would also, if the numbers and probabilities held, end Nash. Croy had time, a small, stinging amount, to make a decision. The fleet had constructed a plan predicated on his silence. He felt the weight of that silent expectation as if it were a hand at the base of his skull pushing him towards submission. Croy had never been trained for moral cowardice. He had been trained to listen and to do minimal damage. "Stay," Nash said, with a softness that did more than any military directive could.
Hold me. The command was not a demand. It was a request leveled against the wide, terrible ledger of centuries. I looked at the Enigma, at the deep tiredness pooled in the old being's body. I thought of the fleet and its tidy words, and its penchant for cleanliness when it came to death.
He thought of the small hydroponic fruit and the way Nash had tried to use 2 hands when Croy had once joked he was clumsy. He thought of being called expendable and how that word had become a chain. He crossed to Nash and placed his hand where the Enigma's heartbeat felt like a distant bell. The connection was immediate, an avalanche of pressure carrying 1,000 small histories. He could feel the walker's wound like an old map that had been scoured too many times. The places where sealant had been applied and cracked again, the line of a scar that ran like a seam, the memory of crews once laughing. In the pulse of those memories was sacrificial calculation. Nash had already counted losses and made himself the resting place for an uncountable number of them. "Then we hold differently," Croy said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "We make them listen." Admiral Bernance's reply came through the comms like a hard rod of policy. "You cannot allow a contagion beyond containment," he said. "If the guard fails, your choice." "My choice is not your ledger," Croy answered. He did not look at the Admiral through the comms. He looked at Nash. Bernance's face, projected, gleaming, unworried, took on the briefest shade of something like irritation, and then folded it away. "You must consider the fleet, Croy." Croy considered the fleet. He considered his designation. He considered the hush of the walker's innards that had become home. He considered that being in Omega had taught him to exist as a channel for other people's noise, to hold it until it did not hurt. He was an asset in more ways than one. He might have been sacrificed. He might have been silenced. Instead, he closed his fingers around Nash's wrist and said, "Then consider someone else's life." That small defiance was a pivot. It was, in its way, the first clear act of rebellion he had committed. For a person whose life had been diagrams and forms and the bland arithmetic of value, it felt dangerously thrilling to choose. Croy had not signed up to be a martyr. He had signed up to listen, and if possible, to give comfort. He had not expected to have to choose between being obedient to a ledger and being faithful to something that felt in his bones like right. He had not expected the answer to arrive as the cold, methodical voice of a man who once in his youth had solved problems on paper. "You are making a political choice, Commander," Bernance said. His voice had a new edge. "You understand the consequences?" Croy did. Consequences had always existed as a long tail. They might mean court-martial for those who defied orders. They might mean the fleet pulling the walker into quarantine and trying again with more lethal instruments. They might mean retribution the size of whole systems. But they might also mean a life saved, a rift sewn tight without burning the Enigma, and a refusal to let a sentence like expendable define the shape of a life.
The moral arithmetic, he decided, would be less compromised if he refused to be used as a pawn. There was a light in the hull like dawn, and a sound like the first rain falling on a roof. The Armada took its station, the breaker aligned, the galaxy, for a breath, held its hat. If you're hooked by Croy's world, keep listening for what happens when he meets the being who has held the sky for centuries, a soft voice suggested, and the words, when they came, felt less like an advertisement and more like a benediction. The breaker came at them like a small, deliberate sun. It arrived in a ribbon of geometry, precision engines aligning, graviton coils screaming into orchestration, and the walker answered as only something that had been living with ruin for centuries could, with a braced, almost resigned, breath. Croy felt the change long before the instruments registered it. The walker's mood collapsed into a dozen intersecting frequencies, each one a tremor in his bones. He moved through them like someone swimming through glass. Outside, the Armada had set itself into a ring and trained its brass instruments to a single aim. Camera eyes blinked, data feeds synchronized, orders passed like a prayer through cold throats. The breaker-loaded ship held the focal node. The weapon was an equation in metal, an intent given teeth. Croy watched the line of ships, and through his training and the peculiar nerve that shaped his life, he read their rhythm as if it were a heartbeat. He could hear the fleet's intention like a separate voice, rational and thin. Test, neutralize, secure. Inside Nash, the body of containment thrummed. The Enigma's breath was an undercurrent, a slow tide of strain.
Croy felt the walker's memory surge up like old reefs caught in a storm, images of crews, of hands, of sealed compartments. The breaker was an old enemy in a new shape. It was the kind of thing Nash had trained against centuries ago, the instrument design meant to cleave rock and field and bones. The walker had been designed to hold such blows by taking them into itself, by being the sacrificial sink. For 500 years, Nash had practiced being crucible and dam. Protocol Zero, Bernance intoned from 1,000 thin displays, his voice a distant policymaker's calm. If the guard fails, recover data. If not, his mouth hardened, we will proceed. Croy had watched too many men like Bernance build contracts out of syllables. He understood the language of contingency. He also understood the shape of the hand at his back, the fleet that would file a report and call it a test. He closed his eyes for the length of a breath and counted the silence between the Armada's engines. There was no time for hesitation. Nash's eyes, coal-soft, rimmed with the faint gray of age, found him. In them Croy saw not the cold calculus he had expected, but an ancient fatigue refined into something like resolution. Nash did not waste words.
His attention slid over to the breaker's feed like a tide following a moon. If it comes, Nash said, voice a low pressure on the air, I will hold. Croy's fingers found Nash's, the enormous wrist folding like a tectonic shelf beneath his palm. The contact was heavy and warm and steady. No, he whispered, because that was the last honest syllable he had. We hold different. The breaker fired with the intimacy of destruction. It did not roar. It arrived as a pressure wave that bent instinctively to the walker's containment fields. Instruments flared red. The hull shuddered as if a giant had run a hand along its side. Croy was certain he could hear the crackle of reality at the point where the beam touched the walker's skin. The sound was wrong, full of sharp little teeth that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Nash answered by channeling. He drew the beam into himself, letting the gravity matrix feed into musculature and organ like rain into a sponge. The walker groaned, seals flared, and ancient alloys screamed. For a while it seemed to work, the breaker's logic meeting the walker's learned discipline, the destructive intent soaked into Nash's body and converted into heat, into rechanneling vectors. But the strain was enormous. The Enigma's bulk listed with effort, the pressure rose. Nash's skin, those ridged matte planes, began to emit a thin filament of light as the containment wound tightened. Croy's resonant core vibrated with every modulation of Nash's hold. He felt the primitive arithmetic of sacrifice in the Enigma's decisions. Count the costs, bear the weight. It was a moral geometry Nash had been born into. Croy's muscles clenched and unclenched. He could hear the fleet's monitors mapping the strain and annotating it as acceptable. He could hear Bernance's voice shaping into the sort of policy that carved people into acceptable losses. Hold, Bernance said, and the word had been polished until it sounded necessary. Hold until recovery units. Nash coughed, a sound like rocks grinding, and Croy caught the taste of iron on his tongue, the walker's blood running hot in his mouth through proximity. There was a rhythm to Nash's containment now that no longer resembled the slow, patient shapes of earlier. It was jagged, staccato. The walker's breath shortened into small animal lungfuls. Seals that had been braided for generations peeled loose. The enclosing field hiccuped. Croy felt the theorem inside him rearrange. The thing he'd always done, listening until pain quieted, had a variant he hadn't explored, to translate and to extend. If Nash could turn destructive frequency into held energy, perhaps those frequencies could be rewritten, not simply muffled. It was a thought he had never said aloud, and yet in the claustrophobic center of the walker it felt like a possible prayer. Link with me, he said. Nash's luck was both question and instruction. He could not move like a human. His gestures were deliberate, scaled. Yet the invitation rolled across the shared space like an answered bell. They had no words for the act they were about to commit. Protocol manuals, fleet doctrine, and the archaic hymns of Enigma training offered frameworks, but not the poetry they needed. Croy steadied himself by drawing breath and humming a thread. Nash answered with a pressure that was not uncomfortable, but immediate, as if the entire walker had leaned toward him to listen.
Their contact was less of touch and more of overlap, skin to skin, frequency to frequency. The kiss, short, precise, and inevitability, was both an answer and an instrument. It was a press of lips and then a widening of mouths into the languageless. They did not kiss to satiate desire. They kissed to align, to open a conduit wide enough to let intent pass. Croy felt Nash's internal song fold into his own, and alongside the harmonization came the flood of the breaker's core, a violent, collapsing syntax of gravity, intent, and raw engineered will. Croy uncoiled something he had never known he could be, a funnel. With Nash's physicality anchoring and containing the primary pressure, Croy used his resonance to pattern and to translate. His body became a ledger where destructive numbers might be rewritten. He took the breaker's condemnatory pattern and ran it through the small lattice he'd cultivated in patient practice: modulation, re-encoding, translation. He recast the beam's intent from fracture into weave. It was violent, it was beautiful. It hurt in layered ways, muscles, organs, the ghost of ancient wounds, but the engaged motion carried of truth. They were consenting adults forging a new outcome through mutual will. Nash's vast body became the crucible, Croy's smaller frame the precise tool. The two of them turned the weapon inward and, instead of allowing it to cleave and collapse, rewove its frequencies into a net. The net unfurled through the rift like a seamstress's hand. Threads of gravity and memory, of old pain and engineered force, braided together under Croy's guidance into an intentional pattern that did not simply bind but reconstituted. The rift did not scream, it was coaxed. The violent pitch that had been pulling stars apart found itself redirected, threaded into a lattice that closed its trailing edges. Where the void had wanted to ripple outward, energy now fed into a focused knot that drew in the ragged edges like a patient surgeon suturing a wound. As they worked, the walker's skeleton felt the change. The hum that had presided for centuries softened to a new timbre. The breaker's beam, deprived of its original cadence, collapsed into itself harmlessly. The Armada's cameras registered anomalies, then silence. The warships around them held their positions, uncertain, as if the universe had paused to consult a different ledger. When the final loop tightened, something in Croy changed in a way that left no room for denial. The woven lattice did not merely hold, it condensed.
Energy, recontextualized and bonded with the walker's biological scaffolding, began to take on a pattern suggestive of the first, earliest scaffolds of life. Rhythms small and certain, pulses like a new thing remembering how to be. Croy felt a sudden, astonishing warmth pool below his ribs like a second heartbeat. It was not metaphor. It was real, pulling at him with the inexorable logic of Genesis. He opened his eyes to Nash looking at him, exhausted and luminous and not the same as he had been. The Enigma's skin had softened in places where the containment had given. There was relief, but also a kind of rawness. Nash's breath hitched. "What did you do?" he asked, and the voice was a storm-run whisper. "You," Croy said. "We." They collapsed into a heap of relief and trembling limbs. The walking, that ancient keep of grief, sang under repair, and for the first time in a long time, it felt less like an execution site and more like a hearth. The Armada's feeds checked and rechecked. Bernance's projection went white with confusion. He no longer had a tidy outcome to file into the Dominion tallies. "Status," Bernance demanded then, voice clipped with anger that used to be confidence. "Explain the anomaly." Nash unfolded himself with the laborious grace of something waking from a long dream. He raised his head, and in a tone that had once been only a private wether, he addressed the broadcasts that had been watching like vultures. "You chose to send an expendable instead of choosing to speak," he said, his vowels slow and thick as if pulled through syrup. "We have decided to hold different." The line made the Admiral flinch. On a visible feed, dozens of live monitors showed collapse or resistance. News nodes immediately latched on. What had been a tactical engagement had become a moral spectacle. Gossip servers and frontline channels that usually trafficked in fleet gossip now carried the raw field recordings. A human's cry, a huge body's moan, the sound of something sealing like a knot. The public could hear the cadence of the decision. Bernance's composure cracked in a way that was old and dangerous. His office was all policy memos stacked like trophies, and a career built on plausibility. He had to convert uncertainty into statute. "We will contain the message," he said at last. "We will secure a perimeter. No heroics. We need a debrief." There was, however, no way to write away the fact that a living thing had been created where before there had only been an engineered expectation of death. The walker's sensors were now registering a nascent metabolic signature nested within Croy's body. Doctors and scientists at the edge of the Armada's transmission grid cried the word anomaly and then pregnancy in the same breath, which made them sound like people trying to describe a miracle with the vocabulary of spreadsheets.
Croy felt the words arrive in his mouth before comprehension had settled on his bones.
"Pregnant," he said, and the simple sound, so ordinary and impossible, felt like a new planet naming itself in his ribcage. Nash laughed then, an airy, disbelieving sound that turned into a sob. The walker hummed with an unsteady joy. Croy's hands trembled. The warmth below his ribs answered like an echo. For a brief moment they were only two beings who had chosen life in the face of policy, who had turned a weapon into a cradle. Medical teams boarded in a flurry of both reverence and caution. Croy was guided into a bright clinical room, machines whispering to each other in the cool tones of scanners. He lay down on a cot and felt the instruments move over him like gentle interrogations. The physicians were careful, professional. Their faces held the delicate blend of curiosity and empathy that only comes when something sacred presents itself in sterile light. "Nothing invasive," one said, her voice soft. "We need to confirm the pattern, for everyone's clarity." They scanned him, energy metrics, metabolic readings, quantum coherence tests that were used for theoretical physics and morning rituals in different combinations. The scans showed a condensation of patterned energy nesting within biomatter, a hybrid architecture that was neither wholly ethyl nor wholly human. The medical lead, a woman with eyes that had seen too many contradictions of doctrine and heart, called up the diagnostics and announced quietly, "It's stable. The organism is well formed in its initial state. It responds to Croy's resonance." Nash stayed by the doorway like a sentinel turned nurse. He had been diminished by the containment maneuver, but not broken, his breath still heavy and irregular. He hovered at the threshold as if the precise place where he might touch Croy was a map of tectonic plates, and he did not want to risk an aftershock. He smelled of warm ozone and the faint sweetness that had at times suggested rain in a near-forgotten season. Croy looked at him and laughed, a shaking sound that felt like the beginning of prayer. "We have to name it," he said, "because naming made the impossible take a shape they could handle. Nash's attention sharpened. For a being trained in the weight of centuries, the idea of a name carried an axis of authority. "Not yet," Nash said. "Let it tell us the sound it needs." They left the medical bay with orders and cautions. Burnance could not control the narrative. He could only try to contain damage. Public broadcasts had already leaked the outlines. An asset's mission had led to an unprecedented synthesis. The fleet's channels bristled with interpretations. Some mourned what they'd called a failure of containment. Others hailed a miracle. Many were simply stunned. Political voices rose like a chorus, some calling for hearings, others for sanctions, and a few practical-minded administrators asking questions about jurisdiction, about caretaking, about comms protocol. Bernan's, pressed by sudden public scrutiny and the near-impossible optics of what had transpired, convened a live feed. He came on to the main channels with the thin, corporate calm of men who had learned to sanitize guilt into apology. "We will investigate the incident," he said carefully. "We will review protocols and ensure the security of the sectors. There will be oversight." Nash's reply was not bureaucratic. He pushed his enormous face into the projection as if he could reach across and crush the steel of appearances into honesty. "Your oversight will not be the kind that keeps people in cages," he said. His voice shuddered the light for a second. "You sent him to die. You cannot pretend you did not." Bernan's jaw tightened. He read the political ledger in his head, the pulses of the public, the risk to colonies, the legal ramifications. He also felt, maybe for the first time in a long career, the weight of someone looking at him with the unfiltered moral clarity of a being who had literally carried a wound for 5 centuries. The Admiral's defenses, like most well-polished bureaucracies, were composed of preemptive narratives and tidy language. Nash's accusation dissolved that polish on contact. "I will accept responsibility," Bernan said finally, and the phrase fell into the transmission like a stone into a still lake. He added with an edge of calculation that was still human, "There will be reparations. The ethyl sectors will have guarded status. The walker will be protected under an amended decree." The words were not a cure. They were a start. The fleet could not enact instant species-wide forgiveness. Systems of prejudice and fear ran deep. But Bernanz's public acknowledgement, broadcast on every dock and channel across dozens of systems, shifted the ledger in a way that could not be easily reversed. He committed the fleet to a new governance over the sectors, protective stance, formal apology, and a review panel that included Enigma representation. It was legal scaffolding, imperfect and vulnerable to backslide, but it was also the first time the fleet had been compelled to state on record that its previous methods had failed. Croy listened to the Admiral's admission later in the Walker's bright garden courtyard, where hydroponic leaves dropped beads of water like tiny altar calls. He felt the embryo in him as a pulse, as a small luminous note. "You did that," he told Nash, because honesty was a currency they both still trusted. "You made him speak." Nash's laugh was soft. "You made it possible," he corrected. There was no need for grand gestures. Both of them had done the thing, together. The months that followed were a slow, deliberate reinvention of what safety and family could mean. Nash reclaimed spaces that had been reduced by years of duty. Croy learned how it felt to carry an open future inside him and to translate that small private song into practical actions.
Medical teams visited, then less frequently. The Walker's medbay became a place of shared joy, rather than something clinical the Armada needed to monitor. The fleet set up an oversight office as promised, and while not every admiral or captain greeted the changes with warmth, policy began to catch up with the moral argument that had been made in real time. Croy's pregnancy did not announce itself with cliches. It was a series of small phenomena stacked into the texture of daily life. Sudden hunger for the tang of certain hydroponic leaves, the way his resonance smoothed under the child's rhythms, as if the embryo's presence added a chord to his own. The moments each night when the Walker thrummed in sympathy, and Nash would rest his great hand over Croy's belly and murmur old sea songs that had long stitched his insomnia. They learned, both of them, how to change diapers that did not yet exist in manuals, and how to argue over names. When the public needed a face to put on the change, Croy and Nash refused to perform what they had been through as spectacle. They published a measured message about consent, about the ethics of sending living things into unknowns, and about the fragile miracle that had come from two beings choosing to save rather than sacrifice. Time, which had been a ledger for Nash, decided to become a soft tutor. The Walker repaired itself under the combined attention of caretakers and technicians sympathetic to the cause. Systems that had once been covered in rust and worry hummed anew. Nash practiced opening his eyes to small pleasures, the sticky taste of ripe fruit on his tongue, the pleasure of being clumsy with Croy in the kitchen. Croy took to sketching designs for a cradle that could sit on the Walker's inner deck and yet fit in a small shuttle. His small, precise hands learned to weave in ways Nash's enormous ones could not. Love, when it had to be practical, learned to knit itself into the routines of mending. There were hard moments, nights when the embryo pressed against something that made Croy dizzy and hungry in equal measure, when a policy board suggested returning the child for scientific study, when Bernance's new office faltered under internal resistance from factions that preferred the earlier calculus. But the public's attention, once shocked and voyeuristic, stayed long enough to matter. Letters arrived from strange ports, people relaying their own small rebellions of conscience, donations of seeds for the hydroponics, messages from children who now wanted to learn what an enigma was. An archive of apology letters to the Walker began to fill with notes like small leaves pressed between pages. Nash, who had once defined himself by duty and sacrifice, learned new contours of himself in these months. The centuries had given him a particular sort of grief. Meeting Croy had taught him how to hold it differently. He took to carrying the lightness of certain domesticities like contraband treasure. He would sit with Croy under the Walker's open panels at night and practice telling stories of the stars in the voice of a man remembering with tenderness. "There were constellations once," he said one evening, watching a satellite cloud drift by like a shoal of silverfish. "We mapped them because we thought territory contained truth. But we were wrong. Territory contains stories. We must be the keepers of some of the better ones." When the embryo's monitors reached certain predictable markers, response curves, resonance harmonics matching the expected anthropic patterns, the medical team declared the pregnancy viable. There were ceremonies of sorts, small internal gatherings where technicians and nurses and a few fleet delegates who had earned trust by simply listening stood at a respectful distance and celebrated in the muted, human ways available. Songs hummed under breath, a pot of rich tea poured, a plant sealed in good soil to mark the day. The child, warmth, pattern, hope, grew. In the first trimester, Croy found it hard to sleep. Nash's old habits of vigilance crept back, soft and protective. At times, Nash would lull him with low hums like ship breaths, the sound of a great animal turned guardian. He would hold Croy's hand and whisper, "We are not doing this alone. We are answering for a history that is wrong in its arithmetic." By the time the child's movement could be felt, a flutter that felt like the universe taking little steps inside, the world outside had adjusted to the idea that something new existed that represented both a challenge and a possibility. Bernance's office had issued formal decrees that gave the walker protected status and instituted restitution funds for families affected by earlier policies. He'd also faced a board where questions about his choices had sharp teeth and where he had to answer for the expendable calculus that had led to the mission's original parameters. He'd lost some of the faith of certain hardline admirals, but he also retained the political skill that had gotten him his rank. He used it now to build a practical scaffolding for the child's future. The pregnancy continued. Medical visits were less about scanning anomalies and more about curiosity and support. Croy learned to be patient with his changing body and to treat the embryo as a presence that taught him new things daily. How to slow his breathing, how to select the right songs to soothe tonic shifts and resonance, which fruits helped settle the odd nausea that sometimes took him by surprise. Nash learned how to be gentle in a precise way. He learned how to steady his hands near the child and not to uphold the ancient pattern of absorbing hurt by taking it all inside himself. Instead, he built buffers, systems, choice, and the shared decision to care.
When the time came, the delivery, the flaring point where creation moved from inside to outside, it happened in a room that smelled like herbs and hospital sterilant and the sweet brews of fruit. Croy was not alone. Nurses and friends and a small, carefully chosen team stood at respectful distance. Nash hovered, enormous and tender and terrified, because even ancient beings could feel fear of the thing they loved the most. The birth was not cinematic in the way stories sometimes make it out to be. It was contraction and release, the body's choreography in conjunction with engineered support and a kind of communal breath. Croy's resonance shifted form in those hours. Sometimes it rose and braided with the child's attempts to find the air. At other times it sank into a low rumble, anchored by Nash's hands on his shoulders. When the child was finally coaxed into the light, the room held its breath. They named the child Hope, because the word both fit and felt like a formal defiance, a political and personal vow packed into 2 syllables. Hope's skin carried faint traces of both parents, a soft obsidian speckling that gleamed like the inside of a river stone, and eyes that took light the way new things always do, curious and unashamed. The infant made small noises, not quite speech, and each sound vibrated against Croy's chest like a newly struck bell. Nash cried then, in a way that had nothing to do with theater. The Enigma's tears hissed against the sterile floor and made tiny, patterned rivulets. His hands shook as he touched Hope's tiny forehead, and then settled, as if memorizing the exact dimensions of a promise. "We did not let you die," Croy whispered, feeling like both liar and prophet in the same breath, because he had once been sent to die, and now the child existed to rewrite that old ledger. The public response to the birth was a thunder of common nouns and tentative praise. Some called it unnatural, others called it a miracle. The fleet's official language leaned cautious and proud and tried to institutionalize the moment. Bernance's speech about accountability and a new chapter resonated across feeds. There were protests too, groups who believed enigmas were a threat and who considered the child's existence a lampooning of natural orders. The walker's decks received both bouquets and hostile messages. Croy and Nash absorbed them with the protective armor of people who had endured worse and chosen to be gentle rather than vengeful. Raising hope became a communal act in the way that small species used to raise children in the old world. The walker became a place of learning. Engineers and hydroponicists taught how to climb and plant and fix. Old crew members returned, guided by shame and then tenderness, choosing to stay and make amends. Bernance oversaw a restitution fund that aided communities harmed by earlier policy. His admission had not absolved him, but it had galvanized some measure of institutional response. 3 years later, the world had shifted enough to allow a different kind of peace. Ethel Prime's moon, once a sterile outpost and a string of mining stations, had been given a new purpose. Terraforming, carefully managed and ecologically sensitive, had turned gray rock into a rim of green and shallow seas that dulled like mother-of-pearl under the sun. The walker had become a bridge between the sectors and the wider dominion, a living museum and a thriving habitat. Its hull still bore scars, but those marks were now places where moss and engineered lichens fed small, blinking gardens. Hope had become the thing everyone, carefully, in increments, agreed to adore. He toddled with a gait that combined Croy's nimbleness and Nash's heavy-footed deliberation, and his laughter was a resonance that retuned the walker's innards. He had inherited more than features. He had inherited an uncanny ability to hum in ways that calmed static, and to touch a panel and cause a flower to open. It was not magic, at least not the kind that bent laws. It was a gifted physiology braided with circuitry and love. On a mild morning with the sea smelling like star salt and green growth, the family, small and battered and fiercely intact, walked to a cliff edge where the walker gazed out over the newly formed ocean. Hope clung to Nash's enormous hand with a child's confidence, and Croy walked slightly behind, his other hand trailing through the grasses like one learning to write with his senses. There were few public figures in sight. Today was for them, not for the cameras that would sometimes flock. Hope made little chirps and pointed out a sky spattered with satellites and tiny glints of commercial traffic. "Ship," he said, and the word sounded like an anthem in their ears. The boy's hair, dark and velvety, shone in the sun. Nash's face, still lined by time but softened by the domestic practice of care, had the serenity of someone who had found a home that did not demand annihilation. "Tell it a story," Croy said, "because some lessons are best given in small performances. Tell it how the stars learned how to listen." Nash settled on a stone like a great beast curling around small prey to protect it. He looked down at Hope, and the child's eyes widened as if a universe were kneeling to tell him a private joke. Nash's voice was low and thick with the weather of many ages. He began to describe, not in technical detail, but in the cadence of an elder, how he had kept a wound closed for centuries, and how someone had once come to him not to be consumed but to be held. Hope's fingers twined in Croy's, and a small hum passed through them, the resonance of contentment. Around them the walker whispered in gentle electronics, a cathedral at peace. The ocean below beat the same rhythm as a long-distant heart. They had not solved the world's prejudices. There were still debates and old grievances, and those who chose fear over learning.
But there were also harvests and new laws and a generation of kids that asked different questions because they had a different example to read. Nash patrols had been codified into protective statutes. Bernance, chastened and politically weathered, remained an imperfect figure. He had apologized, and he had restructured his duties in ways that made the future less likely to birth tragedies like the one Croy had once been meant to fulfill. Hope reached up and pressed a small sticky palm against Nash's jaw. The Enigma laughed, a sound like gravel in moonlight, and Hope's fingers left a faint smudge of mineral dust that looked like a blessing. "Song," he said, as if stating a fact. "And ours," Croy replied. They watched the tide together, and the walker's hum dipped into a lullaby all of its own making. A small bird, engineered and wild in equal measures, landed on a railing and then hopped off again. In the distance, a relay satellite blinked, offering the promise that news could cross systems and hearts could change. Croy thought of the brittle word expendable that had once been stamped on him like a seal. He thought of the long ledger that had tried to value lives by neat fractions. He thought of the warmth in his belly that had once been the center of a knot and had become a person who would someday run and skin knees and loud questions. The bitter arithmetic had been rewritten. No, not erased. That's not the truth of history. Instead, margins had been expanded. Laws had been amended. People had been forced, by a child's simple existence, to re-examine the calculations they'd used to justify convenience. Nash pressed his massive forehead to Croy's shoulder in a gesture that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with sensation, the touch of a thing that had been made tender. "We kept different," he said. "Yes," Croy murmured. He closed his eyes for a second and felt the world. The small boy's breath, the walker humming, the cadence of surf, the distant, tired broadcasts of a fleet learning a difficult kind of accountability. "We returned with a life," he added. "We were sent to die, and we came back with hope." They did not need to perform heroism. They had become the living evidence that an economy of sacrifice could be subverted by an economy of care. They had not saved everyone.
There would be battles yet to fight, legal, social, personal. But in that fragile, beautiful present, they had a child who laughed like a new frequency, and a life that retuned the sky. Hope protested mildly when Nash set him down, because the boy wanted the throne of his parents' arms like a small prince. Croy picked him up, and felt again that familiar, difficult warmth that had once come like an invasion, and now arrived like blessing. He kissed the child's forehead, and for an instant the resonance they shared snapped into a tiny, private chorus of safety.
If this world had taught them anything, it was that listening could be a weapon against violence, that choice could be a shield, and that two beings sent to contradict a cruel calculus could, quite literally, birth a future that would change a map's lines. They walked away from the cliff with Hope chattering about small wonders, Nash quiet and watchful at the rear, like a mountain that had learned to cradle a stream. The walker behind them sang like a thing content to be alive, and the stars above made a slow, sure music. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more BL space romances and tales of found family. Join us as we keep listening to the frequencies that make the universe sing.